shuttle, a flame appeared to break out between the external tank and the shuttle.
Tom, this has never happened before. I know you are aware that there are contingency plans for such an event. Because it's never happened before, I think possibly many people even involved are not aware what they are. Do they have ships standing by?
There are recovery ships standing by, and they do go through procedures for launch aborts. There is worst-case scenario. Let's go now to the live picture. We see a parachute.
What kind of parachutes do they have, Tom? How many do they have? How much can they hold? Do you have any information?
They're not wearing parachutes per se in the cockpit. There are no ejection seats.
We are coordinating with recovery forces in the field.
Originally in the program, they had ejection seats.
Range safety equipment, recovery vehicles intended for the recovery of the SRB in the general area.
We don't know what's attached to that parachute.
We can't tell from
Those
that camera angle.
believed
It's
to
just
be
too far away.
paramedics going into that area.
It appeared, Tom, that just as they gave the command to Challenger, to the crew, for thrust,
To repeat,
Right,
we
to
had
throttle up the engine.
that was what triggered the
apparently
explosion.
normal ascent with the data coming to all positions being normal up through approximately the time of main engine throttle back up to 104%.
We're looking at
approximately a minute or so into
the new launch pad,
there was an apparent
39,
explosion.
at the Kennedy Space Center.
The flight dynamics officer reported that tracking reported that the vehicle had exploded and impacted the water in an area approximately located at 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west. Recovery forces are proceeding to the area, including ships and a C-130 aircraft.
Tom, did you say the craft was 9 miles downrange?
Flight controllers reviewing their
That was
data
the
here in
last thing we
control.
heard, 9 miles downrange, and just preparing to throttle back
will,
up
provide
over
you with more
100%.
information
We have
as it becomes
CNN's John
available.
Zarella,
This
who
Mission
is at the
Control,
Kennedy
Houston.
Space Center on the live line now. John, you could, I'm sure, see it from your vantage point, even 9 miles down. Describe the scene there.
Tom, it was just a situation where everything looked fine, and then all of a sudden it looked like a giant fireworks display overhead. The weather and the sky being so clear, you could of course see it for miles and miles. And at first, no one was quite sure what we had seen. Everyone was just sort of standing around as if things were going normally. But of course, when I saw that fireworks, sort of a fireworks display, I said, "This is not right. It's not something that I had ever seen before." And at that point, I began questioning what had happened, as we all did. But here now at the Kennedy Space Center, everybody's just stunned. They're in shock. It's a situation where people are just sort of standing around in just bewilderment at this point. And of course, we're not getting any information from here any more than what you are. Only just what we have just witnessed and what we've seen, this tragic incident. It just seemed like everything was going fine, as you said, up until about 9 miles downrange, and then that giant explosion of colors that it just looked like a 4th of July fireworks explosion, and certainly the most tragic incident to ever befall the space program. At least at this point, it seems that way. That's about all I really know.
John, we understand that a C-130 aircraft and several ships are now headed to that point about 9 miles downrange. Can you see any of the recovery efforts going on?
Negative. Not from our vantage point here up on the mound where the press area is. It's all we can see is, of course, the gantry and the empty launch pad, and in front of us the clock, which is still ticking at 12 minutes and now 50 seconds into what would have been the flight. And that is all we can see from this point. Of course, journalists scurrying around and everyone trying to just find out what indeed has happened here today. But no, we can see no activity at all. I did hear a helicopter flying overhead a while ago in the distance, and that was about the only sign at this point from where we are.
We saw a parachute that was floating down probably about 12 or 13 minutes after the explosion. Any word from NASA officials there about that parachute?
No, nothing. As a matter of fact, with just the naked eye, we couldn't tell what it was that was floating down. I certainly couldn't. And NASA is, of course, not saying much of anything at this point until, as I say, they get the recovery ships out there and get the vehicles out there to see what they can find out in the Atlantic Ocean. At this point, though, no word from NASA. They are, of course, as concerned, more so than anybody else in this entire country right now, and want to get everything straight before they start giving out any kind of information. I'm sure we're going to have to wait until those recovery vehicles get out there to the site.
We understand now that the parachute that we saw possibly may be from that C-130 medical personnel and frogmen going into the area. John, you and I have both been at the Kennedy Space Center several times. Every mission, before every mission, they go through the rehearsals of what to do if an emergency develops.
That's correct. And of course, at this point, this early on, it's so difficult to speculate, but it just seemed that it happened so suddenly that all of a sudden this giant burst of fire, these giant colors, the reds and the blues, that it's just who knows whether or not they had time to rehearse any kind of an emergency procedure at this point. If it was just, an instantaneous explosion that no one was expecting, which it seems to be the case right now, God knows whether they had any kind of time to react to that, to prepare for an emergency like this.
Well, the explosion that we saw just a few minutes ago, we're back now to a live picture from a helicopter above the launch area. This is Mission Control in Houston. For the last 4 or 5 minutes, the audio channel from Mission Control has been silent. Not a single word has been spoken while the rescue efforts, if there are any to be made, are underway.
That's the same here, Tom. We're getting nothing here from NASA at the Kennedy Space Center. It has been just dead silence. And over in the press dome where the press gathers, it is much the same, a very, very gloomy atmosphere, and no one saying anything, just standing around and staring in bewilderment and really not knowing what to say or how to say it at this point, I think is the best way to put it.
John, of paramount concern, of course, is the fate of the 7 people aboard the spacecraft. Bearing in mind that we have very little information, let's go for a second with what we have. Do we know at what height the craft exploded?
I have no information at all on that. All I can say is that because it was such a clear day and you could just see for miles, it was certainly in full view when it happened. And I have no idea what kind of height that would have been. It did not seem to be that far out over the water when it happened because of the trajectory of the liftoff. It seemed that it was carrying it almost, straight up from our vantage point. A little, obviously not, but a little over the ocean. And at that point, you could still see it in full view. And then all of a sudden, at first you might have thought were separation of boosters, but of course we know that doesn't take place that early on in the mission. The shuttle had just made its roll and was on its way upward, and then suddenly that explosion. But again, it was in full view, so it certainly could not have been at a very, very high altitude when it happened, and certainly could not have been very, very far downrange.
John, we have some information from NASA right now as to exactly where parts of the spacecraft fell. They were reporting it fell at 28.64 north latitude and 80.28 degrees west longitude, just a few miles off Cape Canaveral.
That would make very, very good sense, Marianne. That's exactly what it seemed like here. Pieces of debris, of course, falling back into the ocean, and you could see them falling. And again, not knowing what it was that was falling off, but knowing entirely throughout the entire few moments after it happened that this was not right. You knew that it wasn't that far downrange or that high in altitude when it happened. I don't know, obviously, how far out, but certainly, again, reiterate, it does not seem like it was at a very, very high altitude or very out in the far out. and it would seem to indicate that they can get to the debris fairly quickly. Of course, recovery ships are always standing by. And again, going back to a point we made earlier, if this had been something they had practiced for, something that they could have aborted and come back to Kennedy Space Center, I'm sure they would have done that. It just seems at this point that it was an unforeseen, cataclysmic tragedy that may have befallen us here today, and that there was no way to make any kind of emergency preparations to come back to KSC with the shuttle itself at this point.
John, we will stand by at the Kennedy Space Center. Let's go back now about 5 hours ago when the 7 members of the shuttle crew were entering in to the spacecraft. Here you see 37-year-old New Hampshire teacher Christy McAuliffe preparing to...
Good morning, Aurora. Good morning, Judy.
There's Judy Resnick on the intercom. She's already inside the shuttle. On the left, you see 39-year-old Ellison Onizuka. For those of you who may just be joining us, the 25th Space Shuttle mission has apparently ended in tragedy in a huge fireball in the sky. Apparently, the solid rocket booster exploded about 9 miles downrange. $1.2 billion spacecraft, only one of 4 in the fleet. This was only the second of a record 15 shuttle flights NASA had planned for this year. NASA says the explosion occurred about 60 seconds into the flight, where they were preparing to throttle their engines up to maximum thrust. They had throttled them down to the 60% level at about 35 seconds in order to reduce the forces of gravity during the liftoff.
Throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
The explosion occurred at a time when Challenger was to enter a period of the maximum stress, when wind and other atmospheric conditions could place the maximum force on the outside of the vehicle. There you see the huge fireball and 2 solid rockets trailing white smoke. That is one of the solid rockets there. After the explosion, we could not see the orbiter itself. Apparently exploded in little pieces, and only the 2 solid rockets floated down. This is a live picture off the Florida coast at the Kennedy Space Center from one of NASA's helicopters. We cannot see any of the rescue efforts underway. They apparently are heading down downrange. Let's go to the White House now and Larry speaks.
And shocked at what he has just seen replayed on television concerning the shuttle launch. We do not have any more information than is being provided to the public at this time. The way the Federal President found out about it is he was in the Oval Office with a group of senior staff preparing for some questions with a group of network correspondents and anchors that were having lunch in the White House today regarding the budget and the State of the Union. The Vice President and the Foreign Policy Advisor, John Poindexter, came in with others and informed the President that the news had just broken. We immediately adjourned our Oval Office meeting and went into an adjoining room, the President's study, where there's a television, and the President then began to review television reports of the explosion there shortly after the launch. So once again, the President is concerned. He is saddened. He is very anxious to have more information on it. At the moment, as I say, we're learning most of our information from what the public is getting.
What is your best information as to the condition of the crew, Larry, at this point?
We don't have any more information than what is being provided to the public on television. Hopefully later we will be able to get some, and that's the President's first priority, is to find out what information that is available. We just don't have any more. No, we have not from the Oval Office.
Will this affect in any way the plans for the State of the Union tonight?
I don't believe so. I'm certain that the President will feel compelled to mention this, depending on the outcome of what we learn here in a few minutes.
Will it affect the shuttle program, Larry?
Well, that's hard to say, you know, here in 15 or 20 minutes after an incident of this type is concerned. I'm sure it will not affect the United States' determination to consider to continue the exploration of space and all the benefits we've received from it. While this is indeed tragic, it certainly will not deter the United States in its interest in space exploration.
All the problems that the shuttle has had, will any substantial reevaluation be done of the program itself?
Well, once again, you're very premature in asking a question concerning the future of the space program. The United States has met adversity many times before in the space program. It is one of the most effective and successful programs of that type that any country has ever undertaken.
Larry, can you tell us anything specifically that the president said, any quotations, and did he make any mention of the fact that the teacher that he suggested, that the program of a teacher in space, that teacher was on board this flight?
Well, I know that was on his mind. Quite frankly, the president stood there in almost stunned silence as he watched the television. You could certainly read the concern, the sorrow, the anxiety on his face as he watched, and the group watched around him. As I say, he was virtually watched in silence.
Might anyone from the White House be leading some sort of investigating team, or will it just be up to NASA to investigate this?
All this is very, very early, and there's just nothing we can say. Our immediate concern is the crew, and all of these other questions will just have to be deferred until much later.
Was anything said about the fact that the teacher was on board this plane?
Well, it was something that was on all of our minds, that we did have the first teacher in space, really the first civilian, so to speak, other than our members of Congress who have flown in space, and certainly that's on our mind.
Are there any scientific aides who have been able to say that they could survive such an explosion?
Just don't have that kind of information yet.
You said that the Vice President, Admiral Poindexter, informed the President. How did the White House learn about it?
I'm certain that we probably learned it from the news media, as we do many times when incidents like this occur unexpectedly.
Might this influence a decision about whether other civilians will be allowed on the shuttle from now on, Larry?
Once again, all of these questions, our immediate concern is for the fate of the crew, to find out exactly what has happened to those 7 people aboard. All of these other questions will just have to wait till later. Dale?
Tell us anything about what the President's schedule, how the President's schedule is changing now?
The President's schedule has not changed. He will keep on with what he had planned today and the State of the Union tonight. And once again, I think the only change in his schedule would be to simply be updated and try to seek the facts in this.
Will the President be making any phone calls to the families, Larry?
I just don't know. It customarily does, but we're going to wait till we find out what the facts are.
Larry, he watched in silence, but were there no quotes that you could give us?
Nothing. It was virtually in silence.
Are you going to know what's being done now, Larry, in terms of searching for?
No. All of that information we just do not have yet. Dale, you had one question and you want to go? Okay.
What are your plans? What are your plans about briefing the rest of the afternoon on that?
Well, I think once we find out what the facts are and particularly what the fate of the crew is, then we'll be prepared to say something.
Larry, did you detect any sign of emotion as the President watched? Was he shaking his head? Was his eyes moist?
Concern, anxiety, silence.
All right, you're looking at a live picture off the Kennedy Space Center from what looks like the vantage point on the vehicle assembly building. Let's go back in time now about 20 minutes as Challenger was ready for liftoff as the last few seconds ticked off the clock.
We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
Liftoff this morning at 11:38 after a couple of delays for several hours.
Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%.
The family of Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian and the first school teacher ever to be launched into space aboard a shuttlecraft, was at the Kennedy Space Center watching today's liftoff. This is not only, of course, let's watch as we see what happened.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Close lights.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
This is a slow motion replay of the explosion. In looking at the slow motion replay, you could see flames break out. There you see one of the solid rocket boosters careening off to the right, still erupting a long tail of flame behind it. In the center of the fire and the smoke, you can't see any form of what was once the shuttle. The one solid rocket booster still moving off to the right. A little later, you can see the other solid rocket go to the left.
We are still not clear as yet, Tom, exactly what was parachuting down here.
We're not clear, but we know that a C-130 was in the area and that medical personnel were dispatched by parachute down into the water to search for survivors.
So this is possibly a rescue effort.
That's right. This came about 12 or 12 and a half minutes after the explosion. All right, the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger, Francis Dick Scobie, was the spacecraft commander. He was born in May of 1939 in Washington State. He became a NASA astronaut in 1978. Michael Smith, who was the pilot of Challenger, commander in the United States Navy, he was born April 30th, 1945 in Beaufort, North Carolina. He became a NASA astronaut in 1980. Judith Resnick, on the top right, is one of 3 mission specialists that were aboard Challenger. She was born April 5th, 1949 in Akron, Ohio. She joined NASA's Astronaut Corps in 1978. Ronald McNair, bottom right, PhD, mission specialist. He joined NASA in 1978 as an astronaut. He was born October 21st, 1950 in Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison S. Unzuka, Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Air Force, was a mission specialist, top left. Became an astronaut in 1978. He was born in Hawaii, June 24th, 1946. Gregory B. Jarvis, payload specialist, was born August 24th, 1944 in Detroit. He was a test and integration manager for the F-1 and F-2 and F-3 spacecraft in 1983. And finally, Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space participant, on the top row on the left side of the center, born September 2nd, 1948 in Boston. She received her BA degree from Remington State College and master's degree in education from Bowie, Maryland. She's taught English and American history since 1970 until her selection from 11,000 other teachers. As a NASA teacher in space, she taught economics, law, American history, and of course she developed the American woman. Okay, let's now go to Bob Kane. Bob?
Tom, we've just learned from a wire report that the students at Krista McAuliffe's high school in New Hampshire were watching the liftoff along with hundreds of thousands of other Americans. They cheered wildly as they saw the shuttle take off in an apparently nominal, very good launching, and then sat in stunned silence when they saw the craft and its fuel tanks blow up. The school principal, Charles Foley, immediately ordered reporters and photographers out of the school. Students were ordered back to their classrooms, and Principal Foley said he would have more to say when he learned what had happened. Marion.
We have already, Bob, of course, had reaction from the White House as White House spokesman Larry Speets described the president's reaction when he was told by the vice president about this tragedy. He was described as being saddened and anxious. There is more official word in response to this from Washington, and let's go to Reed Collins for that. Reed.
Of course, Marianne, the word of the Challenger catastrophe struck Washington like a winter thunderbolt. The House of Representatives was in session at 11:38 Eastern Time this morning, but not for long. The House chaplain, very quickly upon learning of the news, offered a prayer for those off the coast of Florida. James Ford presented the wishes and the will of the House to a chilled and cold House of Representatives.
And at this special moment, let us remember in silent prayer those who were involved in the spacecraft shuttle accident just a few minutes ago off Florida. Let us pray. May your spirit, O Lord, be with them, and may your love follow them and their families this day and every day, we pray. Amen.
And the House of Representatives prayed for the possible survivor of the 7 of the shuttle. Then the Speaker, Tip O'Neill, adjourned the House until 2 p.m. this afternoon. And that is only a portion of the effect of the tragedy of Challenger as far as it affects the nation's capital now, Bob.
Thank you, Reed. And we will pause now at CNN in our coverage for 10 seconds of silence.
To fall from very high altitudes for as long, almost as an hour after ascent. Those teams in place now in the search area. We will provide additional information as it becomes available to us. This is Mission Control, Houston. Robert Nicholson of the Department of Defense just told us that the debris was falling from at least 50,000 feet, and that he doubted that that was the top altitude where debris was falling from. It was the range safety officer who was in charge, who through radar and monitoring this falling debris, made the determination not to allow recovery ships and vehicles into the area until they were sure that all the debris had finally fallen into the water. At the present time, there are 2 H-3 helicopters now being handled by the Department of Defense, with the chief man in charge of the operation on board one of those helicopters. I do not have his name. There is the one C-130 aircraft in the area. There is one SRB recovery ship. Of course, that is the ship that would recover those solid rocket boosters once they have fallen back into the water. There is one Coast Guard hydrofoil on the scene. 2 more H-3 helicopters, Coast Guard helicopters out of Clearwater, Florida, are on their way to the scene. And one Coast Guard cutter from Grand Bahama is making its way at top speed to the rescue, to the recovery area.
At this point, again, they have had no word, according to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson, from the recovery scene as to what, if anything, they have found there. He says that it may be another hour before they have any more information from the recovery scene, from those ships and helicopters that are in the area right now. Tom?
John, is there any indication that Challenger was veering off course? It was very difficult to tell from the picture here, but you were there. Are you hearing anything about the possibility that it was heading off course and maybe going back over toward inhabited land areas?
Nothing at all, Tom. I was standing right out on the edge of the water looking out at the launch pad, and of course, when it took off on that trajectory, it seemed to be making a perfect ascent right up until the moment of the explosion. And there's been so much speculation in the past hour and 36 minutes. The clock's still running on out on the pad. That perhaps at throttle back, that the SRBs they went up to 204%, suddenly increasing in the velocity of the SRBs, and of course that the shuttle cannot handle that. But that is just all such speculation at this point, and that they couldn't throttle them back. But again, so much speculation here as to what may or may not have happened. The one thing that everybody is certain of at this point is that after that explosion, another piece of the shuttle, whatever it might have been, whether it was a rocket or whether it was the orbiter itself, continued on for some time apparently. And no one, of course, knows what happened at that point. At least no one is saying. But again, all right, it's going to be about an hour, Tom.
All right, John, we'll wait for a word back. Those who had never witnessed a launch before are probably not realizing a NASA official climbed a couple of rows into the bleachers to where Krista McAuliffe's parents were standing, walked up and said to them, "The vehicle has exploded." A stunned Mrs. Corrigan looked back at them and repeated the words as a question. "The vehicle has exploded." He nodded silently, and then the realization of what had happened swept across Mr. and Mrs. Corrigan's face. Disbelief at first. Krista McAuliffe's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, watching as Challenger was in flight for 1 minute and then exploded in a huge fireball. It appears that there were no survivors.
Here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately a minute and a half after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived. The dedicated crew members of Challenger are Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialist Dr. Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Dr. Ronald McNair. And payload specialists on board were Krista McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis. All early indications in the Launch Control Center, the Kennedy Space Center, have indicated that the launch was normal up to approximately 11:40 a.m. this morning, about a minute or so into the flight. Flight controllers in the Launch Control Center here and in the Mission Control Center in Houston were polled immediately after the explosion, reported that they did not see anything unusual up to that point. The solid rocket booster recovery ships were immediately dispatched to the area approximately 18 or so miles downrange from Kennedy, along with various Coast Guard and military ships, helicopters, and planes. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. A formal board will be established by the acting administrator very, very shortly. Subsequent reports on this tragedy will be made by this formal review board. I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you.
I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers and overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. We mourn their loss as a nation together. To the families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.